The island of Guadalcanal, November 1942. Rain hammered the jungle canopy in sheets as Corporal James Henderson of the 1st Marine Division crouched in a muddy observation post overlooking a contested supply route. The 23-year-old from Montana had been tracking enemy movement patterns for 6 days, his Springfield rifle wrapped in canvas to protect it from the relentless moisture. He believed he understood the tactical rhythm of this particular sector, confident that conventional marksmanship would be sufficient to disrupt Japanese operations in the area. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Henderson could not have imagined was that his Springfield was about to become more valuable as a theatrical prop than as a weapon, and that a moment of apparent equipment failure would transform him into one of the most effective operators in his entire battalion. Henderson had grown up hunting elk and mule deer in the forests surrounding his family's ranch near Missoula. His father, a veteran of the First World War, had taught him patience and observation before accuracy. The fundamentals had seemed simple in Montana's mountains, where visibility extended for hundreds of yards and game moved in predictable patterns. The jungle presented entirely different challenges. Visibility rarely exceeded 30 yards through the dense vegetation. The humidity caused his rifle's wooden stock to swell and contract daily. Every surface dripped with moisture that could corrode metal overnight if not meticulously maintained. His position overlooked what Marines had designated Trail 7, a muddy pathway the Japanese forces used to move supplies between their coastal positions and interior strongpoints. Intelligence estimated that approximately 200 enemy soldiers operated in this sector, rotating between defensive positions and supply duties. Henderson's assignment was straightforward observation and occasional interference, the standard work of a scout sniper in the grinding campaign for control of the island. On his 7th morning in position, Henderson detected movement along the trail at first light. 3 Japanese soldiers emerged from the tree line, moving cautiously in single file. They carried supply packs and appeared focused on the terrain immediately around them, watching for tripwires and booby traps that had claimed numerous casualties on both sides. Henderson settled into his firing position, controlled his breathing and squeezed the trigger. The Springfield's sharp crack echoed through the jungle canopy. Henderson immediately worked the bolt to chamber another round, a motion so practiced it required no conscious thought. But as he brought the rifle back to his shoulder, he noticed something unusual. The 3 soldiers had not scattered for cover, as trained troops invariably did after contact. Instead, they had frozen in place, looking around with expressions of confusion rather than alarm. Henderson fired again, this second shot intentionally missing by several feet and striking a tree trunk to the soldier's left. The impact sent bark fragments flying in a visible spray. Yet again, the soldier's reaction puzzled him. They looked toward the sound of the impact, exchanged words Henderson could not hear at this distance, then continued moving along the trail. They did not run. They did not take cover. They simply kept walking, now moving slightly faster but without the explosive energy of men under effective fire. This response violated everything Henderson understood about combat behavior. Trained soldiers reacted to incoming fire with immediate defensive action, whether that meant returning fire, seeking cover, or attempting to flank the shooter's position. These men had done none of those things. They had barely acknowledged the gunfire beyond a momentary pause and appeared to dismiss it as irrelevant to their movement. Henderson chambered a 3rd round and aimed with deliberate care at a tree 6 inches to the right of the lead soldier. He fired. The bullet struck exactly where he had aimed, tearing a visible chunk from the tree's bark at chest height. This time, one of the soldiers glanced toward the impact point, spoke to his companions, and gestured dismissively before all 3 disappeared into the jungle on the far side of the trail. The interaction left Henderson deeply unsettled. He had missed intentionally to observe their reaction, but those misses had produced a response that made no tactical sense. Professional soldiers recognized suppressive fire and responded accordingly. These men had barely reacted at all, suggesting either extraordinary discipline or something else Henderson had not yet identified. He spent the next hour reviewing the encounter in his mind, replaying each shot and each reaction. Then a possibility occurred to him that seemed almost absurd but aligned with what he had observed. What if those soldiers had heard his shots but concluded that his rifle was hopelessly inaccurate? What if they had decided that a weapon firing 3 times without coming close to hitting anyone was too ineffective to warrant serious concern? The idea felt almost insulting to Henderson's marksmanship, but the more he considered it, the more sense it made. The Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had been isolated for months with minimal resupply. Intelligence reports indicated severe shortages of ammunition, medicine, and equipment. If enemy soldiers had encountered Marines with damaged or poorly maintained weapons, they might have learned to distinguish between accurate fire that required immediate response and inaccurate fire that could be safely ignored. Henderson decided to test this hypothesis with a deliberate experiment. If Japanese soldiers in this sector had learned to assess threat levels based on shooting accuracy, then consistently missing might actually make them less cautious rather than more so. It was a reversal of normal tactical logic, but the jungle war on Guadalcanal had already proven that normal rules often did not apply. The following morning, Henderson resumed his observation position before dawn. He had spent the previous evening carefully adjusting his rifle's sights, deliberately throwing them off by approximately 6 inches at 100 yards. The modification went against every instinct he possessed as a marksman, but he committed to the experiment fully. If his theory proved incorrect, he could always readjust the sights and return to conventional methods. At approximately 0700 hours, a group of 4 Japanese soldiers appeared on Trail 7, moving south with what appeared to be ammunition containers. Henderson allowed them to reach the midpoint of his observation zone, then fired a shot that passed 2 feet to the left of the lead man. The soldiers immediately dropped into defensive crouches, scanning the jungle for the shooter's position. Henderson waited 30 seconds, then fired again, this time missing to the right by an equal margin. He watched through his scope as the soldiers remained in their defensive positions, clearly visible through gaps in the vegetation. One of them appeared to be speaking, gesturing toward the tree line where Henderson's muzzle flash would have been partially visible through the morning mist. After approximately 2 minutes, the soldiers rose from their crouches. They did not scatter. They did not attempt to suppress Henderson's position with return fire. Instead, they resumed walking along the trail, though now they moved with noticeably less caution than before. Their body language suggested reduced concern rather than increased vigilance. Henderson allowed them to continue unmolested. His experiment had produced useful data. The soldiers had initially reacted to gunfire with appropriate defensive measures, but after observing that the shots missed by wide margins, they had assessed the threat as minimal and adjusted their behavior accordingly. They had made a tactical calculation based on demonstrated shooting accuracy, and that calculation had reduced their alertness. Over the next 3 days, Henderson repeated this pattern with multiple groups of enemy soldiers using Trail 7. He fired at 11 different groups, intentionally missing each time by margins that made his incompetence obvious. Some groups took cover initially but resumed movement after observing the poor shooting. Other groups barely reacted at all, having apparently received word that this particular section of trail was covered by a shooter with a malfunctioning or poorly maintained rifle. Henderson documented each encounter in a small notebook he carried, recording group sizes, times, directions of movement, and reactions to his fire. The pattern became increasingly clear. Enemy forces in this sector had concluded that Trail 7 was monitored by an ineffective shooter who posed minimal actual danger. Their movements along the trail became progressively more casual, with less spacing between individuals and less attention to cover and concealment. On the 4th day of his experiment, Henderson observed a significant change in enemy behavior. A group of 7 soldiers appeared on the trail at mid-morning, the largest group he had yet observed. They moved in a loose cluster rather than a tactical formation, talking among themselves in voices loud enough that Henderson could hear the sound, if not the words, at 200 yards distance. Their rifles were slung casually across their backs, rather than held at ready positions. They showed every sign of men who considered this route safe enough for relaxed movement. Henderson allowed them to reach the center of his engagement zone. Then, with smooth efficiency, he removed his rifle's magazine, retrieved a second magazine loaded with rounds he had kept for this specific purpose, and locked it into place. He reached up and carefully adjusted his rifle's sights back to their proper zero, the adjustments precise, from countless hours of practice. He settled into a solid shooting position, controlled his breathing, and began engaging targets with the methodical rhythm his father had taught him 15 years earlier in Montana's mountains. The first soldier dropped before the sound of the shot reached the others. Henderson worked the bolt, acquired his second target, and fired again. The second man fell. By the time the remaining soldiers began to react, Henderson had fired 4 times, and 4 men lay motionless on the muddy trail. The 3 survivors scattered into the jungle vegetation, but they scattered toward Henderson's position rather than away from it, their training overriding their panic and dictating that they close with the enemy rather than retreat. Henderson tracked the movement of foliage as the soldiers attempted to flank his position. He fired twice more through the vegetation, aiming at movement patterns rather than visible targets. Then he collected his equipment with practice speed and displaced to a secondary position he had prepared 60 yards to the east. From this new location, he observed 2 of the surviving soldiers emerge cautiously onto the trail, searching for their attacker's position. Henderson engaged both from his new angle. Neither made it back to cover. The entire engagement had lasted less than 4 minutes. 7 enemy soldiers lay scattered along Trail 7, victims of a trap that had required 6 days of preparation and a willingness to appear incompetent. Henderson remained in his secondary position for an additional 2 hours, observing the trail for any response to the contact, but no Japanese forces appeared to investigate or recover the fallen. That evening, Henderson reported the engagement to his company commander, Captain Robert Morris, a career Marine from Philadelphia who had commanded infantry on Guadalcanal since the initial landings in August. Morris listened to Henderson's account of the week-long deception with an expression that shifted from skepticism to fascination as the full scope of the operation became clear. Henderson explained his reasoning, said Morris when the corporal had finished his report. You intentionally established a pattern of ineffective fire to make the enemy complacent, then exploited that complacency when they presented targets in the open. That is correct, sir, Henderson replied. The Japanese forces in this sector have been isolated long enough that they have started making tactical assessments based on individual threat levels rather than assuming all contact is equally dangerous. Once they concluded that this particular position was occupied by someone with a non-functional weapon, they stopped treating the area as a serious threat. Morris leaned back in his field chair, considering the implications. Intelligence estimates suggested that Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were critically short of ammunition and had been ordered to avoid contact unless absolutely necessary. If enemy soldiers had learned to distinguish between dangerous and non-dangerous fire based on accuracy, that suggested a level of desperation that confirmed the supply situation was even worse than American commanders had believed. Can you replicate this approach, Morris asked, or was this a one-time opportunity? Henderson had already given this question considerable thought. I believe it can be replicated, sir, he said. The technique relies on enemy forces having enough experience with damaged or poorly maintained weapons that they have learned to make risk assessments based on shooting accuracy. Given the supply situation on this island, I believe those conditions exist in multiple sectors. Morris made a decision that would have significant tactical implications for the next phase of operations. I am authorizing you to extend this methodology, he said. Select 2 additional scout snipers from the company and train them in your approach. I want you to establish positions covering trails 5, 7, and 9. Coordinate your deception patterns to ensure you are not interfering with each other's operations. Report results daily. Over the following 3 days, Henderson trained Corporals William Chen and Thomas Jackson in what had started to be called the broken rifle technique among the Marines who had heard about the operation. Chen was a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco whose family had immigrated to California 30 years earlier. Jackson was a former competitive shooter from Arizona who had won state championships before the war. Both men were experienced scout snipers who immediately grasped the tactical psychology Henderson described. The 3 Marines established observation positions covering 3 separate supply trails in the sector. They coordinated their deception sequences to ensure that Japanese forces encountered similar patterns of ineffective fire across multiple locations. The goal was to reinforce the impression that Marine forces in this area generally possessed poorly maintained weapons or inadequately trained personnel. Henderson took Trail 7, maintaining the pattern he had already established. Chen positioned himself to cover Trail 5, which intelligence indicated carried significantly more traffic than other routes in the area. Jackson took Trail 9, a smaller path that appeared to be used primarily for nighttime movement. For 5 consecutive days, all 3 Marines fired intentionally inaccurate shots at Japanese forces using their assigned trails. They documented every encounter, noting group sizes, reactions, and changes in behavior patterns over time. The results confirmed Henderson's initial observations. Enemy forces rapidly learned to assess threat levels based on demonstrated accuracy, and their caution decreased proportionally as they observed continued poor shooting. Chen reported particularly dramatic changes in enemy behavior on Trail 5. By the 3rd day, Japanese soldiers were moving in groups of up to 12 individuals with minimal tactical dispersion. They carried supplies openly, rather than attempting to camouflage their loads. Some groups included soldiers who appeared to be wounded or ill, moving slowly with assistance from their comrades. The trail had effectively become a safe route in their tactical assessment. On the 6th day, Henderson coordinated simultaneous engagements across all 3 trails. At 0600 hours, each of the 3 Marines adjusted their rifles to accurate 0 and waited for target opportunities. Henderson had calculated that coordinated action would prevent warning from spreading between groups, maximizing the tactical surprise. Chen initiated contact at 0615 hours when a group of 9 Japanese soldiers appeared on Trail 5. He engaged systematically from a reinforced position, firing 11 shots in rapid succession. 8 soldiers fell in the initial contact. The single survivor fled south along the trail, and Chen did not pursue. Jackson engaged 4 minutes later on Trail 9, where a group of 6 soldiers had appeared moving north. He fired from a position elevated approximately 15 feet above the trail in a carefully constructed tree stand. All 6 soldiers fell within the first minute of contact. Jackson observed the area for an additional 30 minutes, but detected no response force. Henderson waited until 0645 hours when the largest group he had yet observed appeared on Trail 7. 13 Japanese soldiers moved south in a loose column, carrying what appeared to be medical supplies based on the distinctive packaging visible even at distance. Henderson engaged from his primary position, firing 17 shots over approximately 3 minutes. 11 soldiers fell in the engagement. 2 survivors escaped into the jungle to the west. The 3 Marines maintained their positions throughout the day, observing for any organized response to the coordinated contacts. Intelligence had indicated that Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were operating with severely degraded communications capability, and the absence of any visible response confirmed that assessment. By nightfall, no enemy forces had appeared to investigate the contacts or recover the fallen. Captain Morris reviewed the results that evening with a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine surprise at the effectiveness of the approach. In 6 days of operations, 3 scout snipers had eliminated 24 enemy soldiers with 0 friendly casualties and minimal ammunition expenditure. More significantly, they had demonstrated that Japanese forces could be conditioned to make tactical errors through psychological manipulation based on demonstrated incompetence. The broken rifle technique spread rapidly among Marine scout sniper units operating on Guadalcanal. Henderson found himself conducting training sessions for personnel from multiple companies, explaining the tactical psychology and the importance of patience during the deception phase. Some Marines struggled with the concept of intentionally missing, their training and instincts making it psychologically difficult to fire inaccurately, even when tactical logic supported that approach. Henderson emphasized that the technique required specific conditions to be effective. Enemy forces needed to be experienced enough to make tactical assessments based on threat levels, but desperate enough that they would accept risk to achieve movement objectives. They needed to have encountered enough malfunctioning equipment or undertrained personnel that they had learned to distinguish between dangerous and non-dangerous fire. Most critically, they needed to be operating with degraded communications that prevented rapid spread of warnings when the deception was revealed. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Hayes, commanding the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, incorporated the broken rifle technique into formal tactical guidance issued to all scout sniper teams in his command. The guidance emphasized that this was a supplementary approach rather than a replacement for conventional methods, appropriate for specific tactical situations where enemy forces demonstrated learned behavior patterns that could be exploited. By late November 1942, Marine scout snipers across multiple sectors of Guadalcanal had adopted variations of Henderson's technique. Results varied based on local conditions and individual skill in executing the deception, but the overall effectiveness proved significant enough that divisional intelligence began tracking Japanese tactical responses to determine if enemy forces were adapting to the methodology. Intelligence reports from December indicated that Japanese commanders had indeed recognized the pattern and issued warnings to avoid trails where ineffective fire had been previously encountered. This created a secondary tactical benefit as enemy forces began avoiding routes that might or might not actually be covered by scout snipers, complicating their logistics and movement planning. The broken rifle technique had evolved from a tactical deception into a broader psychological operation that affected enemy decision-making even in areas where no Marine snipers were actually present. Henderson continued operations on Guadalcanal through January 1943, when Japanese forces completed their evacuation of the island and American control was secured. In his final after-action report, he documented 53 enemy soldiers eliminated through application of the broken rifle technique over an 8-week operational period. He noted that the technique's effectiveness had declined in late December as enemy forces became more cautious, suggesting that tactical deceptions of this nature had limited useful lifespans before countermeasures emerged. After the war, Henderson returned to Montana and resumed ranching with his father. He rarely discussed his wartime service, considering his actions on Guadalcanal to have been simply the application of hunting principles to military operations. When asked by a local newspaper about his experiences in the Pacific, he stated that the most important lesson he had learned was that assumption was more dangerous than any weapon, and that intelligent enemies adapted to repeated patterns faster than most people expected. The broken rifle technique appeared in multiple Marine Corps tactical publications in the decades following World War II, usually described as an example of exploiting enemy behavioral patterns through deliberate deception. Henderson's original after-action reports from Guadalcanal became part of the curriculum at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, where instructors used them to illustrate the importance of understanding enemy decision-making processes and the tactical value of patience. Captain Morris, who had authorized Henderson's initial expansion of the technique, went on to command a battalion in the Marshall Islands campaign and later served in Korea. In his memoirs published in 1976, he wrote that Henderson's innovation on Guadalcanal represented one of the most creative tactical adaptations he had observed in 30 years of military service, and that the corporal's willingness to appear incompetent in order to achieve tactical surprise demonstrated a level of professional maturity uncommon in such a young Marine. The broader implications of Henderson's approach extended beyond the specific technique itself. Military analysts studying the Guadalcanal campaign identified the broken rifle deception as an example of how resource limitations could force tactical innovation. The Japanese forces' desperation had created the conditions that made the technique effective, but it was Henderson's recognition of those conditions and his willingness to experiment with unconventional methods that had transformed observation into actionable strategy. Corporal Chen, who had achieved particularly effective results on Trail 5, remained in the Marine Corps after the war and eventually reached the rank of Sergeant Major. He taught scout sniper tactics at Camp Pendleton throughout the 1950s and consistently emphasized Henderson's lesson that understanding enemy behavior patterns was equally important as shooting accuracy. Chen's training approach influenced an entire generation of Marine snipers who served in subsequent conflicts. Corporal Jackson returned to competitive shooting after the war and won multiple national championships in the late 1940s. He credited his wartime experience with teaching him the psychological dimensions of marksmanship, noting that controlling enemy perceptions was simply another form of controlling one's own mental state during competition. Jackson's writings on shooting psychology became standard references for competitive shooters throughout the 1960s and 70s. The tactical lessons from Guadalcanal's broken rifle operations influenced American sniper doctrine in subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War, Marine scout snipers employed similar deception techniques to exploit North Korean and Chinese force behavior patterns, though the specific conditions that had made the approach so effective on Guadalcanal did not always exist in other theaters. Vietnam-era sniper training included instruction on behavioral deception, emphasizing Henderson's core principle that enemies made tactical decisions based on observed patterns and that those patterns could be deliberately manipulated. Modern military analysis of the Guadalcanal campaign recognizes Henderson's innovation as an early example of what would later be formalized as psychological operations integrated with direct action. The technique demonstrated that tactical deception did not require elaborate props or extensive planning, but rather careful observation of enemy behavior and willingness to exploit the assumptions that behavior revealed. Henderson himself never claimed particular credit for the broken rifle technique, maintaining that he had simply applied common sense to an unusual situation. In a rare interview conducted in 1968 for a military history project, he stated that the real lesson from Guadalcanal was not about any specific technique, but about the importance of questioning assumptions. Everyone assumed that shooting accurately was always the right approach, he said. It took actually watching the enemy react to know that sometimes missing on purpose was smarter. That is true in hunting, and it turned out to be true in war too. The statistical impact of Henderson's operations provides context for understanding the technique's significance. Over 8 weeks, 3 Marine scout snipers using the broken rifle approach eliminated approximately 90 enemy soldiers while suffering 0 casualties themselves. Conventional sniper operations during the same period typically achieved ratios of approximately 5-to-1, with scout snipers accepting significant risk during their stalks and engagements. The broken rifle technique's force multiplication effect came not from superior marksmanship, but from superior understanding of enemy psychology. The technique also demonstrated the tactical value of patience in combat operations. Henderson spent 6 full days establishing his deception pattern before attempting his first actual engagement. Most conventional sniper operations focused on immediate results, with shooters taking opportunities as they presented themselves. The broken rifle approach required delaying gratification and accepting short-term ineffectiveness to create conditions for long-term success. This emphasis on patience reflected Henderson's background as a hunter in Montana, where successful hunts often required days of observation to understand game patterns before attempting a shot. Military training typically emphasized aggressive action and immediate results, creating cultural resistance to approaches that required extended preparation phases. Henderson's success demonstrated that hunting mentality could sometimes produce better tactical outcomes than conventional military thinking. The broken rifle technique also illustrated the importance of individual initiative in combat operations. Henderson developed his approach without authorization or oversight, conducting his initial experiments based on personal observation and tactical intuition. Captain Morris's decision to support and expand Henderson's innovation rather than demanding adherence to standard procedures reflected leadership wisdom that recognized when subordinate creativity deserved institutional support. This balance between individual initiative and institutional support became a subject of study in military leadership courses. The Guadalcanal example demonstrated that effective organizations created space for tactical innovation while maintaining enough structure to scale successful experiments across larger formations. Morris's role in authorizing Henderson's expansion and ensuring the technique was properly documented allowed a single Marine's observation to influence divisional operations within 2 weeks. The legacy of the broken rifle technique extends beyond its immediate tactical impact on Guadalcanal. The operation demonstrated that warfare's psychological dimensions could be as important as its physical dimensions, and that understanding enemy decision-making processes could create tactical advantages as significant as superior weapons or numbers. These lessons informed American military doctrine throughout the Cold War and continue to influence contemporary special operations planning. Henderson's service on Guadalcanal earned him a Bronze Star for valor, though the citation made no specific mention of the broken rifle technique. He accepted the decoration with characteristic modesty, noting that he had simply done his job as a scout sniper. He never pursued military fame or recognition, preferring to return to civilian life and the familiar rhythms of ranching in Montana's mountains. The men who served with Henderson on Guadalcanal remembered him not primarily for his tactical innovation, but for his quiet competence and reliability under conditions that tested every Marine on the island. The broken rifle technique represented just one aspect of his broader capability as a scout sniper, though it was the aspect that proved most replicable and therefore most significant for the Corps as an institution. In the end, Henderson's legacy rests on a simple but profound insight: that enemies are thinking beings who make tactical decisions based on observed patterns, and that those patterns can be deliberately shaped through deception. This insight seems obvious in retrospect, but its application required courage to deviate from standard procedures and patience to execute a plan that offered no immediate gratification. Henderson possessed both qualities, and 90 Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal discovered too late that the broken rifle they had learned to ignore was anything but broken. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.